Hello, I'm Giles Swan. I'm one of the regular trainers at the Financial Supervisors Academy. I deliver a range of workshops on a periodic basis to MFSA staff from across the organisation to support capacity building and to make sure that staff have access to important and topical issues. Today, I've just finished delivering a workshop on the EU's Markets in Crypto Assets regulation. This is a really topical issue, given that the MiCA regulation fully applied from the end of last year. In the workshop, we talked about a range of important issues for supervisors and that are emerging for crypto asset service providers and other token offerers from the regulation. We started the workshop by looking at a Crypto 101 to level set on what blockchains are, what crypto assets are, and also how distributed ledger technology works. We also talked about digital wallets and the importance of these wallets for holding, buying, selling, and storing crypto assets. We then looked at various different aspects of the MiCA regulation. We started off by talking about the history behind the MiCA regulation, why it exists, what the objectives of the regulation are. And then we looked at some of the different rules that apply to crypto asset service providers and to token offerers. We talked through some of the implications for these rules and some of the areas where the framework is still being developed. One of those areas in particular is the scope of the MiCA regulation. And we looked at the way in which the scope deals with tokens such as non-fungible tokens or NFTs. We looked at the way in which the MiCA regulation deals with DeFi. And we also talked about a range of different issues for the classification of crypto assets. We spent some time talking about stablecoins and the way in which the MiCA regulation defines stablecoins as asset reference tokens or e-money tokens. And we talked around some of the classification issues and some of the requirements for the offerers and issuers of such tokens. We also talked about the really significant portion of other crypto assets that are covered by the MiCA regulation and spent some time looking at Bitcoin and Ethereum and how some of these tokens and the blockchain networks that underpin them function. We then talked about some of the supervisory issues concerning the custody and the administration of crypto assets. And we spent around an hour or so in the workshop going in detail through the rules for the custody of crypto assets and the different custodial and private key wallets that can be used as digital wallets to store crypto assets. We looked at how each of the wallets works, the pros and the cons, and some of the security issues that emerge from using one wallet over another. We also talked about the way in which public and private keys are used to facilitate the sending and the receiving of crypto assets. And we focused particularly on the importance of keeping the private keys for digital asset wallets secure. We looked at how private keys are used to facilitate crypto asset transactions and some of the issues and areas of focus for supervision teams. Finally, we looked at some of the interactions between the Payment Services Directive 2 and the MiCA regulation. This is an incredibly topical issue at the moment, given the work that the European Commission is doing and the European Banking Authority is doing to deal with the interface for PSD2 and MiCA. And this occurs primarily because of the definition of e-money tokens in MiCA as electronic money and therefore potentially funds under the Payment Services Directive 2. We talked through some of the consequences of crypto asset service providers needing to attain an additional license under PSD2. We also covered the request that the European Commission has made to the European Banking Authority and to the European Securities and Markets Authority for a no-action letter and how that letter may progress, some of the consequences from different outcomes from the no action letter, and also the way in which crypto asset service providers are thinking about some of these issues. So we covered a wide range of different issues at various levels of detail to provide a really good primer on the markets in crypto asset regulation, on crypto assets, on blockchains, and focus particularly on crypto custody and Payment Services Directive 2 to give the MFSA staff a good primer and good level of base knowledge to go and explore and find out additional information. So the training was hopefully successful, and I look forward to repeating further training sessions in the future. So in the workshop, we did a 101 on the EU's markets in crypto assets regulation. We looked at how the regulation came into being, what it covers, what the regulation's objectives are, and then dived into detail around some of the rules in the MiCA regulation for crypto asset service providers and for token offerers. Now, we started off by talking about the origins of the MiCA regulation, all the way back to the creation, indeed, of Bitcoin in 2008. We looked at a timeline for the development of the MiCA regulation through from 2014 to the Commission consulting on various aspects of proposals for the MiCA regulation in 2018, to the proposal for the regulation itself in 2020, and then finally the political agreement that was reached in 2022. We also talked about the evolution of the regulation throughout the negotiations in Brussels, and the way in which the efforts by Facebook to create the Libra and latterly the DM project influenced the way in which the regulation was drafted for stablecoins. We then talked about the various different objectives for the regulation, including consumer protection, financial stability, market integrity, sustainability, and operational resilience. And we looked at each of these different areas and how the rules in the regulations apply to achieve these objectives. We then looked at the different aspects of the regulation and how it applies to crypto asset service providers. We talked through the different rules that crypto asset service providers are subject to and looked at the different crypto asset services that the regulation covers. We also talked about our expectations for token offerers and the way in which the rules require token offerers to issue white papers and, in the case of stablecoins, to comply with various other requirements, including reserve requirements. We spent some of the workshop talking about the scope of the MiCA regulation. We looked at how the regulation classifies different crypto assets, those crypto assets that are within scope, and those crypto assets that are explicitly out of scope. We talked about the overall scope of the regulation and the fact that it deals predominantly with centralized crypto asset services. We discussed the fact that DeFi activities are out of scope where they're fully decentralized. And we also discussed that the scope doesn't cover certain tokens, such as non-fungible tokens. We looked at how the regulation classifies crypto assets into three different buckets. The first bucket being asset reference tokens, which are tokens which reference a basket of different currencies. We discussed the rules that apply to the offerers of asset reference tokens, or ARTs as they're sometimes called, and the criteria for determining whether an ART is significant or not. We then looked at e-money tokens, or EMTs. We looked at the rules for offerers of EMTs and discussed that EMTs are those stablecoins which reference a single currency. We finally talked about the other category of crypto assets, including discussing utility tokens and the range of different crypto assets that fall within that category. We talked about the scope of MiCA in terms of non-fungible tokens and discussed that MiCA on its face carves out non-fungible tokens from its scope. But we also talked through some of the classification issues for non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, including the recent guidance from the European Securities and Markets Authority, which seeks to define which NFTs are within MiCA's scope and which are outside. This includes NFTs that are fractionalized and also NFTs which are parts of collections or series. We discussed some of the challenges in defining the full spectrum of decentralized finance and the consequences of this for whether activities are deemed to be within the scope of MiCA and therefore crypto asset services, or outside the scope of MiCA. And we discussed some of the challenges for supervisors in defining this accurately. So during the workshop, we talked about crypto asset custody. And we looked at a number of different aspects of how custody of crypto assets works and how this is regulated within the MiCA regulation. So we started off by comparing crypto asset custody to custody of traditional financial assets. We talked, for example, about the way in which you would custody or safekeep physical assets, such as a bar of gold in a safe or in a vault. And then we talked about how you would safekeep dematerialized assets, such as a dematerialized share. We then compared this to how custody works for crypto assets. And we looked at a range of different types of digital wallets. And digital wallets are essential for storing, for transacting, for buying and selling crypto assets. We looked at 4 different types of digital wallets. We looked at hot wallets, which are connected to the internet. We looked at cold wallets, which are offline wallets. We also looked at different types of custody. So custody through private key wallets or self-custody. And we also looked at custodial wallets that are maintained by third-party custodians. We spent some of the workshop talking about crypto asset custody. We discussed how crypto asset custody works and compared this to custody in the traditional financial markets. We started off by looking at 3 core concepts that are important to understand crypto asset custody: public keys, private keys, and that crypto asset custody wallets do not hold crypto assets themselves, but instead store the private keys that allow transactions to be signed and undertaken. We discussed the different ways in which crypto asset custody is regulated and talked about some of the issues for supervisors in overseeing crypto asset custodians. We also discussed how crypto asset transactions work and the role of public and private keys in these transactions. We used a couple of examples to describe what a private key is and what a public key is. One of the examples was thinking about public keys as similar to a postal address, a destination that you would send something to. And that's very similar to the way in which they work for crypto assets, because a public key or a wallet address or a public address is very similar, and that is the address to which you would send crypto assets. We compared this to a private key and likened this to a password or a combination on a padlock that allows you to get into a safe, or, for example, a postbox. So if I was to post an item to a postbox, I would know the address, the public address that the item would be posted to, and then my private key would be like the combination on the padlock that I would use to get into the postbox to get the item that had been posted to me. We talked about the importance of keeping private keys secure and the different methods which are used to secure private keys and digital asset wallets. We used 2 examples of these security methods. We discussed multi-sig wallets, which require multiple parties to sign a transaction before it is approved and sent to a blockchain for validation. We also talked about multi-party computation wallets. These work in a similar way, but rather than requiring multiple signers to provide private keys, They require multiple parties to provide a small shard or part of a private key, which together is used to sign a transaction. We discussed some of the security risks and the pros and the cons behind these different wallets. We then looked at the regulation of crypto asset custody, and we talked about the MiCA regulation and the rules that it imposes for custodians when they're providing the crypto asset service of custody and administration. We talked about the crypto asset service provider requirements to have a custody policy and to clearly disclose to users of the custodian how the custodian operates and the security measures and procedures, systems and controls that are in place.